And then move to Damaris. And if you haven't had a chance to speak up, I'd encourage you to step up and lean in and speak up. And if you have, maybe to step back for a minute to create some more space for voices that we haven't heard. But what were, what were some of the themes that came up as you thought about Robert? The challenges for him, his own journey around transitioning at a new school, the experiences of his parents and the challenges that they were having. Any pieces that came up in thinking about those questions, or threads that came up not about those questions, but other pieces you thought about? Anybody? So let's start with Robert. What were some of the things that you saw he was struggling with? Any hunches about other pieces that might be going on?
Well, I'll just say, hello?
Yep.
I'll just say that we were able to identify with the parents' concern for him being a black male in the affluent white community, and engaging in smoking weed that could potentially lead to negative consequences with the police and such. And we also wondered how much the peers at his new school really knew about his transition, and how much I guess that the smoking was like coping with like potentially being bullied before, just even the stress from the parents that he's now having, and just wanting to fit in now that he's already being accepted in this new school as, transition. And it just not really, I guess registering in his mind how, the weed use could be like a slippery slope and how all these other consequences. So how there's just really kind of bringing even more than two pieces, it seems like, to it.
And any thoughts about where you might begin to work with Robert? What kinds of things you'd want to explore? What you might want to validate when you were working with him? Anybody, any thoughts?
Probably just validating that he's going through several transitions at this point with regards to gender, school, even just adolescence in itself is very confusing. And so sort of just like validating, giving space to talk about that. Maybe he doesn't want to talk about gender as the first thing he's talking about. He wants to talk about. And popcorn. Sorry.
This is the way it is in a session with a family, right? You're on the spot pretty quickly.
Yeah. I'll just kind of share where my thoughts are going. This vignette reminded me just how easily complex this gets. And then kind of jumping to kind of a little bit more of like, how would you work and work around? We kind of talked a little bit about just working with the family. Just kind of at the basic level, it seemed like there wasn't a lot of understanding of parents understanding what their son's life was like, but also the son of understanding what the parents were going through with his actions. And so that would be kind of a very powerful thing would be to get the family to kind of start talking about these worries and concerns.
Definitely in this vignette you can see some social justice pieces, right? You want to kind of go in there and start talking about all the current situations going on. But what's really important is just kind of affirming the parents' fears, like reaffirming like, man, this is really difficult for you right now.
Right.
Many people would just ignore or walk away, but what's keeping me from helping Robert with coping with this, And, originally I'm thinking my clinical hunch is to talk about intersectionality, right? All those pieces, the race, the SCS, the background, all those things. And perhaps using a bit of collaborative language systems, kind of going with the language that's being brought into the the family to affirm and kind of hear them out. I myself am an humanistic experiential therapist. So, you know, when I think about this, it's like so important to identify those pieces and giving them a sense of agency for both the parents and Robert, but understanding like this is very difficult right now. Just going from there.
Anybody at this table, any other threads about working with either Robert or the whole family or the parents?
Kind of piggybacking off of Nealy, but I'll be really curious to know, kind of taking a narrative approach, but what does it mean to be a black man in today's society, given the current socio-political climate, for parents as well as for Robert? Because it can mean two different things. For Robert, he's a younger, 9th grade, and for parents, you know, they've lived through different generations, or different decades, I guess, so they might have different understanding and definitions of what it means to be a black man in this society. So I would love to thicken that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess just to kind of tack onto that too, what, especially in an affluent, you know, predominantly white area, what kind of narratives, what kind of identities is Robert feeling able to explore as, you know, as a trans man exploring the, you know, identity of, that's all I needed to say. I can say it once or like 4 times, I'll choose one.
So one last question. In what ways would the intersections of your own social locations as the family therapist play a role in your work with Robert and his parents? What would be challenging about the intersections of your own social locations? What aspects of that would you feel you could lean into and draw on? How would it look different depending on the intersections of your own social locations? Anybody have thoughts? That's okay. So we can open that up again because this is a. So there's a mic.
Like, because I feel like as a therapist, it's hard for me not to bring in the social justice piece. Like, I'm an advocate. I also think about the parents' concerns in terms of what's happening to black men, and for me, it's happening to trans people as well. And so the fact that we're erasing that, so their concern is twice as much.
Right.
The fact that he's a black man, the fact that he also identifies as trans, that would be like something that I would like to explore. And also as a black therapist, you know, like it's close to your heart because I have experience with family members who dealt with that kind of thing, and also growing up in a predominantly white institute. So the moment they bring it up, it's so easy to be like, girl, I feel you on that. Like, it's always hard, like trying to manage being a therapist and also like trying to hold them and say I get it too. Like it's always hard, you know.
It is complex, right? And I think it's complex no matter what the intersections of our social locations or identities are. But I also think you're absolutely right. No matter what our intersections are, we have to be direct in talking about it, right? And in my work, certainly with Robert and his family, we talk very openly about my identity as a white man moving through the world, how that experience affected my lens, the ways that my identity as a parent gives me certain connections, right? And understanding of, you know, for those of us that are parents, one of the things we do when we're afraid for something about our kids is we often get angry. I had an incident of that just a couple of weeks ago, right? Our youngest, they're 13, came bounding in from the front room where she was hanging out with some of her friends, excitedly telling me, Dad, we're talking to a guy who lives in Japan. And I'm like, what do you mean you're talking to a guy who lives in Japan? They downloaded some new app where you can have conversations with people all over the world. And like, you know, and I got angry. I sounded angry at least, right? And we ended up 10 minutes later when she came back and said, I'm gonna go to Marcella's house. We're gonna hang over there now. And I said, is that because of something with us? And she said, well, you seem angry with me. So I think we'll be more comfortable there. And then we had a conversation about, all right, I wasn't angry, I was worried, right? And here's why I was worried. And the thing you need to understand is that parents, when they're scared or worried, they get angry, right? They yell, right? We don't really mean to be angry, but it's just the way it is, right? And that's another piece I think that you were saying about that often in our role as family therapists, we serve as translators, right? So, you know, what Robert's perception of his parents being on his back, being angry at him about, sort of helping translate that, helping the parents find different language to talk about that. I think the narrative pieces there could be a great way to open up that conversation and get sort of intergenerational conversation about what it means to be black, what it means to be a black man, what it means to navigate intersections of class and race and gender. So yes, all of that I think needs to be talked about. And I think for so many of you who, in terms of social location, identify as a person of color, have certain dynamics around that. When working with families and clients of color, those of you who identify as white like me have our own challenges and work we need to do about learning how to lean into those conversations and not shy away from them and not take a pass on them because we're white-skinned and we can often take a pass in conversations about race and racism. Right, and an article that really years ago, it's not a recent article now, but a colleague of mine, Thondaway D. Watts Jones at Ackerman Institute in New York, wrote an article a while ago in Family Process about how she has those conversations about different aspects of oppression and privilege with families, and how she opens those conversations up, and that's become a real model for me and part of what I teach in the MSW program. Right, that they're pretty upfront right after we've done an assessment. We talk about the similarities and differences in our social locations and how they might facilitate our work together or how they might hinder it. And in doing that, I think right up front allows us to have some of that conversation and send a message that we as clinicians are willing to talk about that, right? And it can be about gender, race, gender identity, class, any of that.
I had a question. Do you have any advice for, so in that situation, I identified with my client. How do I connect with them when I don't? Or maybe my own experiences conflict with their experiences, where I probably I don't even agree with what's going on. Like, how do I hold myself in that situation and still be able to be a support for them, based on your experiences?
Right. So one thing I would say is that sometimes we have an assumption that shared social locations is good and differences in social location is a barrier. So one thing I want to say is that's not necessarily true, right? That sometimes when we share certain social locations with clients, it does maybe give us a more intuitive understanding from our similar lived experience of what that client might be grappling with. But there are other times when a shared social location might mean we don't listen as closely as we need to. So if I'm working with a trans man, that shared social location does many times give me an intuitive sense of some of the emotional dynamics that other trans man is navigating. But it can also mean the risk of assuming that his narrative is like my narrative and not asking enough questions, not being curious enough about what this experience is like for him. And that, I think, is true across race and class and gender differences, right? And so, you know, there are times when I have shared social locations where I may use our or we language, right? When I'm working with families, often, you know, as a parent, we often struggle with, right? So I will sometimes use that, but I'm careful not to equate our experiences as parents. Right? And so I may use language like, as parents, we often struggle with, has this been true for you? Are there ways that this has been different? Which allows that conversation to be expanded, right? And you know, in particular, when I'm working with families from other racial ethnic backgrounds, I'm very clear in talking about my own identity as a white person, as a white man, the fact that I have not experienced the same shared lived experiences around their racial identity. I often say that I have worked hard to look at that and examine my own privilege and power. And there are things that I will probably understand from my social network and experiences with clients, as well as friends and colleagues from their racial background, but other things that I will not immediately understand. And that my hope is we can create a safe enough environment to talk about those places where I may not understand all of the nuances of what an experience is like for you. Right? So that is part of how I try to talk about that. And
Going on with that, and like where your intersectionality is coming from and the experiences you can relate to your clients and you can't, as we were reading our vignette, I was just thinking about how it's important for the therapist to be curious enough to ask about the experiences and to be able to process that while also embracing where they are now. And that can be confusing for the client and therapist. And I was thinking to try and find a way to relate it to issues I've worked with, like working with a parent while also exploring issues from their childhood, while embracing the child and then also the parent of them. I think I think that it just brings to light how important it is to just know enough to ask the right questions, but also that being from a distance, you can actually, respect the ability to maybe embrace both pieces. And I think I appreciate the comments because I can see the advantages and disadvantages like we're talking about, depending on how you can relate.
yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Damaris. Where would you be at in this conversation with Damaris, 17-year-old Latina trans woman, having a girl that she's pretty crushed out on, thinks she wants to get involved with, but is really sort of grappling with ways in which her existing body parts aren't what's considered expected. How do I negotiate this and be sexually intimate? And you don't get it. Any thoughts about how would you respond in that moment?
One thing I was thinking of was, not being someone who's trans, someone who's cisgender, I would have to say there is a certain degree to which I do not get at all what you're going through. I don't understand that feeling of crawling out of my skin or not being able to identify or hate parts of myself or not even identify as part of myself. And so I would validate that how isolating that must feel, but that I'm curious and want to understand what it is, that they want me to get, and own that I'm not going to relate to certain aspects of it and not assume that I can eventually get it.
Anybody else? Where you would be in that moment? How you would respond to, you don't get it?
I think when I was going through this a lot, for my own pot issue, kind of it just says how she's lost, very confused as well. I think I can relate to my own process when I was going through my sexual orientation. So I think that comes up for me, being lost, and I wonder how, what it is for her to be a 17-year-old Latina woman growing up, a trans woman. How is that for her, her acceptance? And then also I think it's important to have the support group. Does she have a support group? How are friends accepting her? Because just being in my own social location in Philadelphia, there's so much support around the LGBT community, and I wonder what support system does she have that she can kind of get out of this. You're not going to get it because it's hard working. For me, it's difficult working with that community still, but to have that support and reaching out to them will hopefully feel less confused.
And it may well be her lived experience that many people don't get it. Right? Don't get it. And depending on what support network she has, how affirming they are, whether there are also other trans women in her age cohort, there may be experiences of people not getting it, right? And if you think about being 17, how much do 17-year-olds even get to talk to many adults about sex or sexuality even, right? That's still, we don't talk about that an awful lot, right? Anybody else?
I always feel like an important part of it is to really turn towards the you don't get it. I think there's a lot of different ways to do it, but this is but I think turning towards that and saying how many other people don't get it, and let's talk about that and what's infuriating about that, and kind of even being able to use that as a way she's not identifying necessarily like overtly as feeling like shame in any way, but I think being able to really bring in dominant discourse and talk about how like this social world that we live in is the problem, and I think using that to create space for anger and whatever comes up can help build safety and trust sometimes. So.
This is my last time. Okay, I guess thinking from like a sexual education perspective, I think this case reminded me the work that needs to be done in broadening and deepening the definition of sexual intimacy. Because we have this very heteronormative idea of what sex would be like. So when she says we didn't really have sex, whatever kind of contact happened could have been very much sexual, but because it's heteronormative, she like casted that out the window. Another thing, she says, I want her to touch me, but not like this. So maybe exploring like what would you like to be touched, and then exploring her sexual history, because we don't know if she's ever had any partners in the past. So exploring what those experiences were like, what were some positive, what were some negatives, and then moving forward. And someone in my group, I'm not gonna mention your name, they mentioned the Latina perspective about what messages is she hearing from her co-chair, maybe any spiritual or religious parts that may be impeding how she sees her body or understands sexuality, that probably is not even connected to her trans identity. But we know those things compound and those like reinforce each other. So those were just a few.
Good. I had that exact conversation about heteronormative notions about what sexuality is with our 13-year-old daughter a couple of nights ago at dinner. She was telling me about a 13-year-old girl in the other middle school in our town who was pregnant and gave birth, and her mom is raising her baby, and that led to a conversation about sex, and she was saying, you know, I don't want to have sex, I'm too young yet, and you know, then I sort of thought like they did, like, you know, well, there are lots of different ways to be sexual, right? And sometimes people think that the only way to be sexual is for a man to put his penis in a woman's vagina, but there are lots of other things that people do that are pleasurable, right? There are lots of different ways people have sex, right? And so I think that is an important piece, and I think sort of leaning into that, you don't get it. Sometimes we have a tendency when a client says you don't get it, or a client is angry, sometimes we in a human place get defensive, right? Or worried, but really leaning in and being curious, right on the money, right? And so it might be, tell me more about what you are worried I won't get. It might be acknowledging, you're right, there may be certain aspects of this that I don't get because it's not my same lived experience. But I'm interested in this. Who else doesn't get it? What have your other experiences been? Sometimes normalizing, like, you know, even sexuality and becoming sexually intimate is challenging enough, right? For young adults, for adolescents, even adults many times, let alone navigating that as a trans woman, right? And I think totally that when we're working with trans youth of color, trans youth who are immigrants or whose families are recent immigrants, cultures other than white dominant US culture, that we have to be talking about both the messages they've gotten from the dominant white culture, the dominant class culture, as well as messages they've gotten from their own racial ethnic groups, messages from peers, messages from adults. So many layers of messages that young people are getting about sex and sexuality. And so I think all of that important. Anything else about Damaris?
So I'm so glad that y'all brought up the idea of heteronormativity, because when it asked about like your cultural and familial beliefs and your own sexual history, when I read this, being a lesbian woman, my first thought was, honey, there's a lot that you don't need a penis to do. But, you know, in all seriousness, that's probably not how I would approach that. But, you know, you say that and you're right, because, you know, we do need to really like broach that idea of intimacy and the fact that, I mean, I still get questions of, but it's two women, so I don't understand, how do y'all have sex? Like, are y'all constantly stuck at third base? And I'm like, take a deep breath. Okay, we're gonna explain this to you because nobody ever has. But also, you know, my wife is Hispanic, and so, you know, she comes from that predominantly Catholic culture that permeates Latinos in Texas, and that was one of my other thoughts too, as you talk about, you know, your group talking about the Latina perspective, is her parents are just very don't ask, don't tell. So my first question was like, do her parents, I mean, obviously they're going to know if she's living as a trans woman, but like, how much do they know? Do they even know that she has a girlfriend? To them, does that mean that like their son has a girlfriend? You know, all of these other things, because I mean, we're legally married, we don't sleep in the same bed. Her parents don't even actually know that we're married. So, you know, like there's all these extra layers that, you know, I'm curious about, which obviously I'm sure you could have, you know, written us a 20-page paper on her, but yeah, so those were my thoughts as I was reading it.
One more maybe.
I was piggybacking off of what she was saying. Does her girlfriend know that she's trans woman?
Right.
Was another curiosity of mine, because, yeah, that was the question. I was curious about that. Maybe you can help me.
Right. And I think, actually, what's your name?
Jessica?
Jessica. So actually, I more and more am leaning into those conversations of like, honey, there are a lot of other ways to be sexual, right? Like with adolescents, right? Because again, I think adolescents often don't have many places to talk about that, right? Or talk about what the sort of dominant heteronormative understandings are. And that's not just relevant for queer adolescents, right? I mean, as far as I know, our 13-year-old daughter is not queer, right? Who knows? That could change. But like, I want her to know, if she turns out to be a pretty heteronormative, straight young woman, I want her to know that when she wants to be intimate with men, there are lots of different ways to do that, right? And to be pleasure. And she doesn't have to let some guy have intercourse with her if she's not ready. That was part of our conversation. And if they want to be sexually intimate, there are other ways to do that. So I think we need to lean into those conversations more and more. And often they begin by getting an adolescent or young adult to tell us more about what messages they've gotten, what understandings, the definitions their age cohort has. But I really believe that some of our work is doing sex education around that, right? And some of it we may do directly, or some of it may be connecting young people with resources. But I think that is an important piece, right? And that's relevant for all youth, queer, trans, or not. But certainly added complications for young trans men and women, where body parts may not match who they know themselves to be, where body parts may be uncomfortable. I also want to bookmark that not every trans woman is profoundly dysphoric about having a penis, if she still does. Some trans women navigate that, manage to enjoy that. There are stereo assumptions often that trans guys who haven't had lower surgery, that they would never have heteronormative sex, but some trans guys do, right? Some trans guys are comfortable using the vaginas, whether they use that language or a term like mangina or some other language for that body part. So not all trans people have huge dysphoria about body parts, right? And so that's an important assumption not to make, right? And sometimes trans people have those kinds of gender normative assumptions, right? So I've worked with trans women who felt like, well, I can't enjoy my penis being pleasured because I'm a woman and I shouldn't like that. And there's messages even in trans communities about what's okay and what's not. Or trans male communities that if you somehow enjoy having your vagina stimulated or whatever, labia, that, you know, you're not a real man. Right? And so trans young people and young adults have often internalized some of those same messages. So I'm struggling with what is always true in 2 hours on this, which is we barely scratched the surface. But I actually want to give you just a brief clip of a family vignette and have a little bit of conversation about that and really what you would do next. So, and I do write about this vignette a lot in my book, and a lot of material we haven't covered is in the book. But, so you do get to read and sort of channel me more as you read the book. But I worked with one family where their adolescent had come out, maybe about 14, as identifying as a trans guy, assigned female at birth. There was also an older brother, about 2 years older. It was a mom and a dad. And we had worked together maybe 9 months, even close to a year, and he had now socially transitioned, was going to school in 9th or 10th grade as a young man. The parents had struggled a fair amount at the beginning, but gotten on board. Dad a little bit easier than mom getting on board, but it was mom that went to the school, advocated about his transition, met with the school personnel, set that all up so that they would use his affirmed gender name, even though it hadn't been legally changed yet. They would use male pronouns. Mom was the one that set up the appointment with a pediatrician when we began to explore puberty blockers to help manage some of his dysphoria, because getting his period every month as a 14, 15-year-old trans guy, hugely dysphoric, right? And puberty blockers can shut down the estrogen and sort of alleviate some of that dysphoria when we're not ready to begin masculinizing hormone therapy yet, right? But we do want to manage the dysphoria so that he's not cutting. And he was highly suicidal. In the beginning, every single session, we were doing a suicide assessment. And so, but at one point, a number of months after he was living now as a young guy, he came in and his clinical depression was still pretty intense. He was small built and a lot of trouble at times drawing him out and engaging him. And so toward the end of one session, I sort of said, you know, is there anything else we haven't talked about today that's important to talk about? And he got quiet and sort of did this. And you know, when you work with adolescents and you ask if there's anything else, anything we haven't talked about, and they do this, it usually means yes, right? And so I tell him that, you know, well, that sounds like there might be a yes there, and he's quiet again. But then what he shares with me is that past week, he and his mom and his older brother had been watching TV in the living room, and somehow the conversation around abortion came up and people's different ideas about it. And so this young trans guy says to me, and so when we were talking about that, I asked my mom, if you had known I was trans when you were carrying me, would you have aborted me? And then he says, and my mom said yes. So what are you feeling right now? Just call out some words. What do you feel?
Crush.
Cold?
Sad.
Almost frozen?
Rejection.
Rejection? Pain? Anger? Confusion? What's that? Sadness? What would you want to do in that moment with that 15-year-old young trans guy? What would be your first impulse? That was mine too, right? Everything inside was like, oh, I just want to like, he's kind of small built and he's curled up in a ball on my couch. It was like, I just want to like grab you up and hold you, right? And I don't know if I can not cry myself, right? And I do think it's okay to cry sometimes with clients. But that was certainly my impulse. And what about your feelings toward mom in that moment?
I'm wondering what the context of what she, you know, things about systems and things of that sort, what context have informed her of why she feels that way.
Mm-hmm.
So where's her background?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering why she would say that to me. I mean, even if you feel that
You don't know
way,
why she
just
would,
say
right.
things that they don't
Well, why in the world would any parent say something like that, even if you did feel that way, right? Right? How in the world could you say something like that as a parent? And that certainly went through my mind as a parent, right? And I have two adult kids who, one came into my life through most of his life in child welfare, one homeless at 14 in New York City when she came into my life. We've been through the mill and back on substance use, mental health issues. There's not anything they could do that would make me not want them to be my young adult son and daughter. Nothing, right? And so there's a part of me that also felt like, how in the world? How'd you be so stupid to say something like that, right? Anything else in terms of feelings toward mom?
that hard for your child, and in the same breath, tell them that if you had known that that's how it was gonna be, you wouldn't have wanted it.
I feel sad for mom.
Sad for the mom?
Sad for both of them.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you think about her, and a lot of people, yeah, we're all for the, but the pain she must be feeling to say that,
Right. Right.
you know, I feel sad for him because I know he's hurt, and for her because that's pain.
Mm-hmm.
Not knowing how to express itself and just being too blunt, too.
Right. Yeah, I don't even want to say leaking out, it kind of erupted out, right? It exploded, but you're right. That there is real pain that just erupted out without the censor that mom would probably normally have, right?
Yeah, one thing that comes up for me around that is the idea that, sometimes I've heard parents say that if I know my child's life is going to be this hard, right, that it's not about, I want my child dead. And because I've heard that also around parents with children with disabilities, right, that if I had known that my life was going to be this difficult, I wouldn't have wanted to do that to my child. And so I wonder if that is happening for mom at all, too, as I'm like angry, but like I'm wondering if that's part of it, just because, yeah.
So I didn't scoop him up and hold him, but and I was sitting. He was on the couch, and we were sitting pretty close at that point. Partly because he spoke very softly, and I had to stay pretty close to hear him, right? And I did sort of scoot in a little more, and sort of I think initially sort of said that really has to be painful hearing that, and tried to just stay with him for a few minutes in that pain.